So I've got the agenda pulled up for today. Like I mentioned, like this is a pretty big call for us. While we have been talking about our approaches and how we wanted to be a more leverageable set of artifacts to the variety of implementations that are ongoing and emerging. We've been talking a lot about the changes and what that would mean to our technical modeling for how we would become a little bit more leverageable, a little bit more use case agnostic. We finally kind of got to the point on our last governance call where we said, well, we need to make a decision. And, we've talked about the framing of this issue. We've talked about the context into why this is maybe the right timing. And now it's time for us to discuss this from a technical perspective and the impacts that it has, and come to a decision on whether or not we will be moving forward with the proposal. So I've done my best to try to kind of break down, because there may be some folks on the call that haven't been on in the past, or that haven't been part of the calls over the last couple of months where this is kind of organically taken shape. So we've got a little bit on the agenda, like how did we get here, and how was the modeling practices that we've employed to date, how were they defined, what was defined, and ultimately, like, what's the documentation that will provide our audience with that continuity, and then to actually just talk through the proposal with the end goal, I think, of ultimately collecting feedback and refining that proposal, and then providing folks with, I think the last time we talked about it on our governance call, with a good week over the forums to provide additional feedback. And ideally, the governance call that we have on the 9th being used to review that feedback to date, decide on how to disposition it, and depending on how much feedback there is, potentially making the decision on actioning. So any piece that folks want to make sure that we discuss before we jump right into it on the agenda, any questions that we have about how we'll get to that outcome? If not, the only other thing I'm going to say is there are a couple places in the agenda today where it might just be helpful for me to kind of jump in the guide. I've got them in the slide deck for displaying, but for folks who do want to navigate to our documentation on processes and on must support in our guide, the best way of kind of getting at that is to go to our continuous integration implementation guide, and there's some specific links I'll provide in the chat now just to get us going if you want to open those up in tabs and view alongside some of this discussion. Okay, so recap of kind of how did we get to the point where we said maybe we do need to reconsider our modeling, and particularly in this area of must support as a mechanism of communicating expectations. So gosh, I don't even know how many years ago we started, but I think it was like maybe 3.5, Mike. But when we started kind of saying we have this need to at least start developing some cohesive practices that authors will start incorporating into their implementation guides, there was an emerging concept around base and an emerging concept around core, but there really wasn't that many references for how it was being done outside of a highly successful US core and an emerging and kind of nascent Australia base. And so when we started as a community coming together and kind of defining our scope and our intent and our principles and processes for executing against them, we used what was available as a reference point for at least reacting to. This was how the US core did things. This was how the AU base did things. Do we think that works in our context? And do we want to incorporate that into our processes? And so one of the first things that we set out to do after doing a lot of work from a governance perspective on kind of saying this is the role that we want to play in the community as a grassroots developed implementation guide was to start with a set of profiles that people could react to. And to start and provide at least a kind of a preliminary foundation that was evidenced in what we might expect some of our systems to have if they also were systems that were compliant to US core. And so streams, I think it was 3 streams actually that originally were set up to begin the exercise of both kind of inductive and deductive profiling. So starting with, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in the next slide, but like starting with what were the constraints that we were seeing other folks put into their profiles, and then comparing them against context in Canada, as well as what was present in existing implementation guides. The biggest thing to keep in mind is that like this was an iterative and organic process. And so the more we learned about how the community was using our profiles, the more we were able to kind of refine our processes, and that included refining our processes for how we defined must support in our particular implementation guide, because it's something that's defined in each implementation guide, you know, the meaning and what the expectations are meant to infer. And in addition to refining our profiles over time, that meant we were also refining our processes and understanding best on how to make technical choices that would make it easier for them to use. And when we started with this intent of being kind of easy.
I'm going to have to.
Oh, sorry. Was there a comment? Or maybe just someone on getting muted. Okay. Throw it in the chat if you do have a question or comment you want to pause. So use case agnosticism been really important from the start. It was one of our kind of initial set of principles. We wanted to be able to be leverageable across a number of different implementation guides that we knew would be developed in FHIR in Canada. And that meant ensuring our constraints were appropriate and didn't reflect expectations that were rooted in use cases that would be difficult to apply elsewhere. So we've kind of had checkpoints, I think, throughout this process where we were able to say, okay, well, how do we build the level of confidence that those constraints were applied correctly? And we developed a due diligence review process about, I want to say it was 2 years ago, but it was still a very kind of organic, deductive way of incurring more use case agnosticism in the profiles. And so what we said was, you know, if someone picks up our profile artifacts, they want to be able to know how mature they are, and they want to know whether or not that kind of depth of assessment has been done on them. And so we use this kind of process where this is the DDR process, where we compared existing Canadian and international profiles against the constraints that we had applied in the CA baseline profiles, and decided on points that required relaxation because, for instance, a constraint wasn't incorporated or appropriate in a target guide that we were reviewing. And then really that became our main way, aside from community input and community feedback, of relaxing back from our starting point. And so what we found was, as we did more and more of these due diligence reviews in the first couple sets, like it was like wide changes. We were able to see like there were places we were more prescriptive and that didn't line up to the reality of other implementation guides. And so those larger changes and like, decisions to remove a number of must supports across the profiles kind of were largely accumulated in the first number of rounds that we did of due diligence reviews. And then as we did more and more and more, we found more and more frequently that we were more or less synced up to at least the underlying constraints in the profiles that were being developed across Canada. And so it kind of, we were getting less, I don't know if you want to call it like value in the amount of changes that were coming, the more implementation guides that we saw introduced into the Canadian sphere that we were comparing to. And so we kind of hit this point where it's like we were as use case agnostic as we could get to from this process. But when we started seeing other bases and other cores develop, and we actually started talking to those folks, actually this would be January 2023, my apologies, earlier this year, we started to notice that we had kind of been an outlier in our use, particularly of must support. There were some comparisons that we did around other types of constraints. And so it really drove home, in addition to our ongoing activities to make our profiling and extension artifacts more leverageable, it really drove home that we have to do something differently, because we have this gap between what others are calling use case agnostic and how they're modeling that, and what we could get to from a kind of organic removal process over time. So I'm going to pause there really quickly, and I'm going to ask if there are questions, or if folks do want to review some of like the development principles that I've put in the chat, just to frame any gaps in how we got here.
Sorry, Sheridan's Anne. I joined a little bit late. So you put the development principles are just in the
Yes,
chat?
it's our development process. I'll repost it here, and I'll pull it over just so folks can.
And so essentially you're going to get rid of all the must supports, right? Like,
that's what we're talking about, and talking about what the mechanism would look like that would potentially still identify the ones that we've done this thorough comparison against, but removing the technical application of the must supports in the structure definitions.
so you'd still have it buried somewhere else in the guide.
Potentially. I think what we've heard, what we originally proposed and discussed on the call last week, was to provide it in the section,
But
the
your must
profile
support
page
is, but
section.
it's not
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Anne.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out what it would look like. So as somebody who's develops implementation guides and looks to core, I don't know, I've found it to be really sort of useful to have a quick look and go, okay, you know, these are the things. So I think I would still have that available. It would just be not in the written portion of the guide, I guess, and not in the profiles. Is that right?
That's part of the current proposal. Let's circle back to your comment, because I think that you're getting into like maybe how we might want to refine the proposal and what the benefits and costs would be. And I just want to make sure we set up this is how we've made the decisions to date before we
Sure.
can do that.
Okay. Yeah.
Lorraine, do you have another question?
Yeah, I was just going to briefly react to Anne's comment, and I'm going to miss the second half of this call, so I'll try to get it in quickly now. I think that where we really need must support, and I think it's not in very many places, it should be the computable portion of the structured definition. But I think it should be used very sparingly, and we should start with only adding it in when we have a clear justification for doing so, rather than the other way around. Because I don't think we would say we'd never use it, but because there might be some places where we should. But it's not our, I agree with it not being, it being something we don't use to the extent that we've used to date.
And on that front, I think I wanted to just give a quick view of the extent we've used to date, just to frame some of that for folks. So we've got, like I said, we've got our development principles. I talked a little bit about how we defined, how we went through the process of applying must supports the first time in terms of using the existing constraints that we were able to identify in those other guides. We, after this process, still landed in a place, and I've just pulled up the condition example we reviewed in the last two sessions, where, like to Lorraine's point, like we have must support applied in a number of places compared to the base that we see modeled out in Australia and the core that we see modeled out in the UK. What I think we don't know is what is the appropriate place, like how to differentiate between the two, to your point, Lorraine, which is if
we truly intend something to be a must support, narrative text doesn't help, right? Because we want things to be computable, to Anne's point. But I think there's probably lots of spaces where their must support isn't appropriate for our broader range of use cases.
So to date, and I'm going to pull up an example, we have a couple places where in the guide we've called out, let me see if I can pull up condition, should supports, just so I can show.
Yeah, I have a challenge with the should support concept, but anyway.
All right. I don't actually know if condition. So right now in the guide, first point, we do have a human readable, non-structured definition call out of our must support elements. We stopped kind of using this as a primary means of communication when we were heavily in the due diligence review process, because it became difficult to kind of keep them in sync in two places. I don't know if that's I don't believe that that would be a continuous consideration against the use of this piece, but I do think you're right. We have to balance it against what do we give up when we no longer put it in the structure definition. We did, let me see if I can find a should support. It might have been like on allergy. This is a pretty new concept that we started applying as well to things that were kind of like late stage removals that we thought would be applicable in many scenarios, but that weren't strong enough to be upheld to our rules of.
Is it on condition maybe?
I just checked condition, like the immunization.
I was gonna say, I think I remember this conversation, but
it might have been the practitioner stuff as well, because it was around the same time that the community feedback was coming from the BC guides.
I don't think there are any on practitioner registry, but maybe.
If I can't find them, what I will say is it uses the same quote unquote mechanism. It's effectively a place in the guide where we've said, these are areas that we previously identified as meaningful and significant across a number of clinical use cases, but that our due diligence review principles of removing when we found, a degree of evidence that there were use cases and guides that did not use it, forced us to remove the actual flag on the profile itself. So it was a way of differentiating, starting to go down this path of, we don't want to lose our progress of the identification work, but there were some things we already identified that we couldn't reasonably keep the flag on.
So are you saying that, like, yeah, so some implementation came along that and they said, we can't always provide a birth date, or what caused you to move? But I mean, I can see if that was mandatory, but what was the condition for birthday? Because presumably it was optional. I'm just trying to understand your definition, like a actual case where you had to, remove the must support, and also like what a should support is.
Let me see if
I'm very curious about that, because I think we need sort of something like that, but.
I think we removed some of the must supports from practitioner based on the fact that there was no way the provider registry could actually support it.
And
okay, so it was optional, but then it came forward that it was, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And your should support, what's the definition on that?
So effectively initially identified as clinically meaningful in the profiling work. However, has had a number of use cases identified against it that do not utilize the must support flag. So it's kind of like when you're somewhere between an edge, like having a few edge cases and having like mixed adoption, mixed support of something.
right?
Because we've removed things that maybe were introduced that across the board really didn't have good support of.
Sheridan, so this is okay. So I'm just going one step back. So I think you did explain earlier, but what makes us to look back and see should we modify must support or must not? So is there any case we have, or we are having challenges for adopting the baseline across all the jurisdiction in BC, or there is some other initiative due to which we are trying to go back and look for the must support component?
I think it's multi-part. One of the components is just socially, we can see that this is no longer something that bases typically do. The other piece is, if we wanted a future where we could be formally derived from by a CA Core Plus or something else, our application of must support pragmatically is likely to cause challenges in that process, because that's a place where we would expect more changes to potentially come through, right? So if we've made a prescriptive constraint that then isn't backed in, identified in some of the places around, primary care modeling, then it introduces fragility and dependency on something changing much more rapidly that we anticipate will change, just given the nature of it, implying that maybe we're not as use case agnostic as we thought.
Yeah, and the other consideration is trying to make it as easy as possible for vendors to be conformant. Because depending upon their use case and what a vendor's building, they may or may not have any reason to write any software around some of those elements. So saying it's must support forces them to, if it's not part of their use case.
So
Even if optional.
So in that case, it will go more on the jurisdiction. If they want, they can put the extension, so must support on their profiles, and they will take CA means baseline profile and modify or put the extension for their jurisdiction. Or
Well, and downstream implementation guides, whether they're jurisdictional or a content stream specific, could certainly supply must supports in their context, because those guides have a much better idea of the context. The baseline is trying to be something that we can provide underlying consistency to almost everyone, and then further constrain it. So I guess that's why I said we don't necessarily want to get rid of must support, but we need to be really, really careful about its usage.
And it creates, if we are ever considering a place in any formal hierarchy, must support creates a particular challenge, because if your hierarchy spans more than one organization, or your hierarchy spans more than one project, unless the must support definitions in each guide sync up exactly, effectively, like, your downstream guides inherit the sum total, which makes it a very fragile option, particularly if we want to be able to play within this environment really at all. And more fragile given the fact that we're not a set of profiles that defines against a set of requirements. Rather, we are a set of profiles that makes inferences about what practices we're seeing emerge in the community, which are likely to change.
sorry, so I'm just trying to compare. Like, if you see the patient summary, international patient summary has some of the mandatory domains in patient summary. I'm going a bit off track. And eventually the Canadian standard for the patient summary is we have made all kind of optional, nothing mandatory kind of thing, or must be, which is similar to must be. So are we going in that same direction, or considering the patient summary profiles which we have in?
There's been some due diligence review against the patient summary profiles to remove places that we had previously identified as must support that didn't show up in patient summary, because the idea was that's another area where we might be incurring requirements in our development environments that don't actually map up against large use cases.
Because over there, they have made, I think, everything kind of optional now at this point. Nothing is mandatory.
But optional and mandatory is different than must support.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you. Makes sense.
So I think, does it make sense for us to at least talk about the proposal and then come back to how would we modify this to get the most desirable outcome for the community? Or is there additional framing that we want to do before we have that conversation?
Okay, so my last question. So there was some comments from Lloyd McKenzie, I think. So have we discussed that, or are we?
We haven't yet, and actually that there's probably
Oh.
a good point there, Mikesh, which is what I failed to add to the slide, which is actually a true consideration here, is that the FHIR community is looking at, acknowledges as a whole that must support was a really challenging and is a really challenging mechanism. And so right now there are additional frameworks that are being explored for how do we impose and express expectations in the form of obligations that apply to actors. And we know that that's coming. And so the question came up, I think, from Thomas 2 sessions ago, which is like, if we know that it's coming and we know that we're slightly different from the other bases, and we know that there's work that's going to be done on the CA core that will likely create, maintenance challenges with the CA baseline if we don't become more use case agnostic, maybe this is the right time to try to explore backing away from this mechanism in the CA FHIR baseline, given the context of its use. So that's the other framing piece, is to be aware that there is work underway at HL7 International to define new ways of expressing those various combinations that we tried so desperately to express in the text of our guide, which is if you're an actor and you're in this particular scenario, this is the expectation. So that this is something that's still emerging. But I think what we should do.
Sorry to interrupt, do you think everybody else is following these definitions? Is this the Canadian definition that we're all hopeful that we're all gonna align to, or are people creating their own?
I can at least speak to what we've seen in the due diligence review, which is typically when someone defines an implementation guide at a jurisdictional or at a implementation level, they want to convey a stronger expectation on what they are actually going to expect of their implementing vendors. And so this is probably about the loosest expectation that you can have a definition built around. But in reality, in production, you need much stronger sets of rules. Like, I expect you to display this in a UI, and I expect you to perform this type of behavior, which we could never do in the CA FHIR baseline.
Agree. I guess I was saying, for these sort of core things, though, they might build on top of it, but is everybody kind of following this definition? And then building on it, or are they diverting from it?
For the folks who are on the call, have you come into scenarios where you haven't been able to utilize the must support definition because there's something in it you're asking if it's too strong, right? To base off of, right, Anne?
Yeah, I mean, this was just a funny area for us when we started, to be honest. It was just weird that there wasn't, a Canadian one that everybody followed. It seemed like it was up to every implementer to sort of state their definitions.
And I think that's one of the things in core is that the core FHIR specification doesn't have this is what must support is. They leave it up to each individual IG author to determine what must support means for their IG. And that's been confusing.
Yeah, I agree. Like you kind of want just to be set, to have a Canadian standard for this particular area. So we tried to follow the core, and I think we did, but it
When you
was,
say the core, do you mean US?
I mean, these definitions that we're
Okay.
looking at right now.
Okay.
But there, I don't think when we were doing it, there wasn't a should. The should is new, but
And so, Anne, am I right in assuming that when you looked at these, the resulting scenario was that in your particular set of guides and profiles, you probably had a stronger set. Like you at least met this as the like floor, but you also had additional meaning for your must support.
not globally like this. So I think we tried to adopt these and then add for each data element, because to say you must display this across didn't necessarily make sense either. So there were certain data elements where we would build onto it. Anyway.
So,
just slow you down here.
like when we think about how we can maintain value but reduce risk, I think the question that I've got it in the slides is like, what will that mean for if we remove the must support flags? Does that mean we also remove like our guidance on how we tried to set a definition? And do we anticipate that there's going to be a downside to vendors and implementers and authors if these sections largely get cut? What I'm getting at is there a part of our proposal that we have to be able to accommodate these pieces would remain, but in this context?
Well, if it's not here, then it's really up to every jurisdiction, right? And everybody could interpret it differently. At least this provided me with, okay, something solid that we could inherit. And that's why I was kind of asking, like, what did other jurisdictions do? Did everybody go to this and go, these are the definitions, we should follow these? Because that's definitely what I've done.
I can just quickly speak for Ontario that we were very much involved in coming up with these definitions, just because like this is broadly what we use as well. It's very much aligned in our understanding of how must support or what it means in the context of a sender and a receiver.
Yeah, so given that, I would vote to keep it here, because if it's not here, there's no Canadian guidance on how this is defined. I don't know how others feel.
Are there ways if we keep this that we can mitigate confusion around? I mean, this was a definition for how we use it in this guide. That would shift more to like a best practice. Are there ways that we can facilitate that shift or should facilitate that shift? Because right now I know we'll need to make some updates to both the development process and general guidance. This would be like the must support subsection. But it's up to this group to identify how significant of a change, like if there's things that we want to keep and how to frame the things that we want to be able to keep.
Well, do you feel like this is like the most Canadian definition that we have of how, like, I think it's really strong guidance on how implementers should treat must support in their implementation guides, which is you have your definitions here. I think it's just sort of framing it as, you know, a whole bunch of stakeholders from across Canada have come up with this definition. If you're creating an implementation guide, please use these definitions.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything.
And you can build on
alien.
them,
Yeah.
right? You can build on them, but this is, if you don't have them, as I say, I don't know what a better source is, because do I go to Ontario? Do I go to BC? You know, a lot of these standards are national. So to me, this is the value that this specification brings, is things like this.
Do we think it's uniquely Canadian, or just simply that nobody's gone out and described this at an international level? Because at the time, I always thought it was just, nope, we were trying to understand what was in the international core and develop a pragmatic, educational, communicative reference point for people.
No idea. No idea where you got this, what others are doing.
Yeah, so I remember when earlier on in IPS, the expectations around must support was a lot more loose and didn't define it from a server versus client, or sender versus receiver perspective. And so I remember, that was before you joined us on those calls, Sheridan. Is that we went and kind of formalized it a little bit more to kind of separate the distinction between sender and receiver. And I think it was generally pretty well received, and pretty consistent with all of the participants on the call there.
Within an international guide, you mean?
Yeah, within that guide. Sheridan, the other thing I want to add is I just want to be aware that we factor in any implications on testing and conformance if we do decide to remove the must support constraints from the baseline. By removing them, what are we saying around expectations from participants in the projectathon or other conformance or compliance certifications?
So
And
you're specifically talking to, like, if you build off of this, or if you point to it as a target?
I'm just thinking in the context of, if we have another projectathon, later this year or next year, and we've removed the must support definitions from the guide or from the profiles and moved them to the narrative, what implications does it have on the automation of testing? And then does it say anything, or does it create any challenges in vendors saying, oh, we're conforming to the baseline, but they don't necessarily implement some of the basic things that we want them to implement, that we have marked as must support? Does that make sense?
So correct me if I'm wrong, but the must support doesn't have any impact on the validator.
It does not, no.
So,
but when we're saying things like, let's say patient birth date is a must support element, and we decide to say, okay, yeah, no, that's too much of a constraint, then we remove it from both the profile itself as well as from the narrative section, then that's suddenly saying, okay, well, all implementers that are claiming conformance don't have to worry about birth date anymore.
No, what it says is that they don't have to worry about processing birth date. Like if their system uses birth date, they would still use it. But if their system doesn't do anything meaningful with birth date, they wouldn't have to worry about it.
Right.
And that only that's only in the case where you have a CA baseline profile as the anchor for your test script or conformance expectation. Are you saying, like, is there a risk of vendors seeing removal and equating to instead of a modeling change, this means is a change in expectation or importance. Is it?
Yeah,
that
that's what I'm coming
concern?
from. Yeah,
Okay.
thanks for rephrasing that. Yeah.
Sorry, Jermaine. Just regarding this, your question here. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Well, mass port, this term be utilized quite a lot, and eventually from Alberta side, actually, where I'm working right now, yeah, I try to utilize from this endpoint use case implementation. I just, from my point, temporarily, I just use implementable optional, that's term, to replace it. Actually, sorry, before when through my conversation and my talk, and I might just somehow misleading this concept here, which is, as Ken just mentioned, which is this standard be utilized between only 2 endpoints. Actually, that's not the truth here. And the mass port, I cannot find the original definition or some description and from R4 website, maybe somewhere. But based on my recall is that once you set up mass port, you need to figure out, and for each use case, implementer need to figure out to articulately and to specify for those possible data elements and their attributed value, how to handle it, no matter it's available or not available. That's very important. In other words, actually, this is not just between the 2 endpoints. It's actually directly go to data integration, and which is actually from one HIS, Health Information System, from repository perspective, go to another repository perspective. That's just one instance there. And even can go to another processing engine, let's say. So all those preparation or agreement need to be set up beyond that specific instance of a profile being received or being sent out. Conformance can be done from the sender side, but from receiver side, need to be ready to have all those template or those plan or whatever call it to handle the data set once it comes in with or without the specific attribute value. That's where mass support that comes from. That's based on my understanding right now. And it doesn't just impact the exchange between the 2 endpoints. Actually, it does make a impact to the repository to directly go to the data integrity and the data integration. Thank you.
So potentially we're talking about like maybe some of the negative impacts that occur around when mass supports are applied. We've heard about the negative impacts sometimes of potentially, or at least that we have to acknowledge and address of removing. For the purpose of the exercise, can we assume that impacts will be assessed and addressed, like in a world where we could insulate against any of these concerns around what this will mean and how it's interpreted by a community and how it's currently being used by potentially folks who are using it as reference targets or that are reprofiling from it. Assuming that before we ever removed a must support, that these were answers we had, that we knew, and that we felt comfortable with. Do we think that given our intent of the CA baseline and how we want it to be used, the underlying question of should we be attempting must support or removing it is pushing us towards removing it? Is there anyone who let's hear the arguments for maybe keeping it in the current keeping the actual use of must support. So we'll talk about like how we can make what we've learned to date most useful, but at least of the actual flag that is applied on a structure definition. Is there an argument for keeping it in the context of what we've said we meant to do in the CA baseline?
So, silly question, and I apologize, I just don't know. Does anyone do conformance testing against the baseline? does any vendor look at the baseline and say, I'm starting with the baseline, I'm gonna conform to that first? Because to me, like, you know, in the I think there's generally, you know, you would use the Canadian Patient Summary, Ontario referral, like some specific guide where there are must supports. Because I'm just imagining what this looks like without the must supports, right? You're looking at a profile, you might have some terminology bindings in there and things like that, but if you were just to look at a profile without the must supports, you really, you don't know what the minimum is through that view. And testing aside, let's pretend nobody implements this. You just, that to me is just sort of the loss. You can look and go, okay, I'm creating a profile. Oh yeah, these two elements are must support. I'm going to make sure they're must support in my implementation guide too, because everybody's got together and said that these are important. So I guess that can still be achieved in some other way. It's just really nice to look at that. Just by looking at a profile like that, that tells me that stakeholders work really hard and come up with these 4 elements, and they're important. And they must support. So that's my starting point. I might come up with some obscure reason why it's not in my guide, and that's okay. But without that,
You're kind of fading in and out, Anne.
the guide that is not as useful or as quick to get the same information.
And your voice is kind of fading in and out.
Oh, sorry. Shoot. Okay. I don't know what you caught of that or not. I guess I'm saying it's very useful to come look at a profile, see what those important elements are. I trust the stakeholder group has identified them as key elements that I also need to inherit in my profile. Without you remove those bright red S's and you put them on another page, I've still got the same exercise to do. I've just got to go somewhere that is not quite as handy and useful to dig through text or whatever to find out that these 4 things are deemed to be important by the stakeholder group.
There is the option that we have if the differential view is key in facilitating the practice of basically we would anticipate that the elements would still remain the same. We'd likely apply a comment that indicated similarly, this might be a should support. You would still have a view of what are the elements that are there. What would be removed is the flag. That helps differentiate.
Land on each and every one of those to read a comment.
Yeah.
To tell me what I can see in a millisecond.
Yeah, I mean that is the loss that we get from removing the must supports here.
So I for one am not thrilled with that loss. Like maybe there's just an argument to HL7 to say, is there another highlight mechanism to highlight if you're making them all should supports in essence, and I'm not sure what your definition is, that maybe we just need another color or something, right? Like
from the author perspective, because I think that's the other piece I think I just want to call out around, like, our process to date has been around how do we create consistency in iGuide author practices. So that's one of our main audiences. Is the concern shared around like missing the view that we've become reliant on as authors as that scan that tells us whether or not we're on the right track? Or does it not matter whether or not you see it in a comment on a differential or a guide page right above where the differential would be displayed. Ken, Maria, Rita, I know you guys are, I'm just gonna, Thomas, I know you folks write profiles. I probably missed a few here too, but from that perspective, is seeing it in the differential fundamental?
Sorry,
So
just
I'll state that from a lot of the provincial reviews, or even just walking stakeholders through, or even other implementers through the guides, like Anna is saying, having those, red flags, that little red squares helps a lot to identify, hey, these are the things we want versus, hey, these are the things that we don't care about. Having it, I won't say necessarily buried in the comments because those still show up, but they won't have the nice little red, hey, look at me, shiny bit next to them. It's just a little bit less user friendly. That said, I mean, we're talking about the baseline guide and not necessarily, for Ontario, we're still going to use those must support flags, so it doesn't really have any impact. And I'm sure, anyone who's implementing jurisdictionally or use case specifically, they'll still have those red flags. Yeah, I guess it's really just, and so let me make sure that I understand the reason we're removing it is so that we don't cause any sort of downstream impacts from, let's say, a Canadian Core Plus inheriting from baseline those must support flags or any other sort of future IGs that are based off of baseline to have to contradict what's flagged as must support. Is that the reason we're?
Yeah, and then it formalizes a point. Like, I think that we can expect, because those processes will identify things that we would otherwise change in the CA baseline. But seeing it in a structure definition and a profile, like, I think adds formality to the risk. It's another artifact that's also circulating in Simplifier that folks are pointing to and looking at.
sorry, just missed part. Well, at least what I'm working right now, just for those must support tag and just ask the business side, and if they would like to have this data element or not. If not, just skip it. That's the case. And for any those implementable optional data element, we handle it in the go through the coding procedure and find a common ground specific for the coders and to comply with, and then talk about repository side to see how to handle it. That's it.
See, I would make the argument that the majority of our audience is the highest educated audience that we interact with when it comes to FHIR profiling mechanisms, because our audience is twofold. It's vendors to give them an idea of, here's a summation of the things that we're seeing are showing up consistently across guides, but it's also primarily towards iGuide authors, which tend to be the folks who don't scan very quickly, who read, who look at the comments, who look at things like, things that show up when you hover over requirements, and that look at the pages that surround the guides. And so from that standpoint, I think that audience is less impacted by seeing it show in text above versus text below. But that's my take. So to date, we've heard, I think, feedback around there's helpful pieces in the education, and being able to view it in a way that prioritizes information for a viewer is helpful. But we haven't really assessed that and decided how it sits against the risk. How do we want to do that? How do we want to come to a conclusion? Because I think if we called for yays versus nays on the forum, we'd be pretty mixed right now.
So, sorry if I'm taking you backwards, but why do you want to get rid of these? Because sometimes you're wrong, right?
Yeah,
Sometimes,
and-
sometimes you're wrong and then you have to go update this back. But even if it's text, sometimes you're going to be wrong and you're going to have to go update that.
Yep.
So I'm not sure what the savings is there. And I guess if you've got a profile and somebody is creating a dependency on that profile, and then they say, oh, I actually cannot support this, that creates a technical problem for them, right?
Yep.
And
Or
if,
just
but if it's in text, it's still a problem. It's just a textual problem.
Well, there's a higher flexibility if our text is, we think you should support it versus you must support it.
yeah.
Yeah.
And for the
I've
Massport,
never used the dependencies because of that, but I'm never going to use them now that there's not any must support. I guess I could create a dependency, but what am I getting from that? I'm getting some terminology bindings and maybe some mandatories, I guess, right?
Yeah, the conditional cardinalities in some cases, some invariants.
And there's probably very few of them because you got to be pretty serious before you make something mandatory, I guess, right?
Yep, and that's pretty in line with what we're seeing, actually. Folks, when they develop their bases, are very careful.
Yep. Yeah, because you don't even know about, I'm probably working on stuff that you've never even heard of.
Right.
Right? There's lots of other things that are going on that you don't even, right? Like in the private healthcare world, for example. So,
Is it at least, I think, to say that like we need, do we get at this answer of do we, don't we, what do we do next through another profiling call, and we push back, maybe we allow a more extended period for people to comment. Or do people feel like we're at a place where we could
well,
vote?
can I ask something? How many other authors created dependency on core?
It's,
Like, are people doing that?
there are a handful. Lorraine dropped the call. There is, we at least know BC has put in some initial dependencies. We've talked a little bit about some of the considerations around that at the state that the CAA signs in, but that's one of the ones that have like self-identified.
Mm-hmm.
I do have to drop for another call. I think that we should continue this for an additional round of profiling, unless anyone else feels differently. I think we're probably not in a place where we are collectively agreed on a path forward or even just like a compromise forward. So I think with that in mind, what I'll probably tell Mike is that we can review the feedback to date at the governance call, but we may extend our dispositioning a little bit longer to allow for the next profiling call to conclude and formulate any of the remaining gaps in this conversation. Sound fair?
Yes.
Okay,
Okay. Oh,
Yeah.
right, Mike, you're on.
Looks fine.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
thank you.
Okay, beautiful. I'll upload the
Thank-
recording and